Welcome to the On the Edge podcast with your host, Scott Groves. Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're watching this. It's Scott Groves with the On the Edge podcast, and I'm here with my new friend, Sam Goodwin, who wrote the book, Saving Sam, which you're going to hear all about why we had to save Sam. I say we just get right into it. How does Sam Goodwin end up in a Syrian prison for 2 months in 2019? Let's just hear the whole story. You'll probably talk this whole time, Sam, because you've got maybe the wildest story that I have ever heard.
Thanks, Scott. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thanks for having me. It was great meeting you recently as well. And so really just appreciate the opportunity. Yeah, happy to kind of dive into things however you think makes sense. But in a nutshell, from 2010 to 2020, throughout those 10 years, most of which I spent living and working overseas. I was in Singapore for 6 and in Dubai for 1. I traveled to every country in the world, and some of that was for work, some was for pleasure. But like any worthwhile venture or endeavor in life, it wasn't without its challenges. And perhaps most notably in the spring of 2019, after having been to 180 of 193 countries in the world, I traveled to Syria. And when I arrived, I was taken hostage by the regime. I was accused of being an American spy, accused of collaborating with terrorists. Nothing like this had ever happened to me before. I was held for 9 weeks in some pretty uncomfortable situations. Thank God, thanks to a long list of people who worked tirelessly, the situation ended peacefully and I was released. And in the wake of that, I've really been trying to reflect and put things into context and pull out lessons and messages that I think can be helpful to others today. And so that's where a lot of my time and effort is today, but very much the Spark Notes version there, and happy to talk about it as much as you're interested in, but that's generally how things happened.
Yeah, I want to go to one thing that you kind of just glossed over, like, I had already been to 180 countries out of 193 before I got imprisoned in Syria. And let's talk about that first. Like, how do you start this journey of, I'm going to be the guy that goes to every country in the world? You mentioned you were working overseas in Singapore and Dubai, so that probably had something to do with it. You get a lot of layovers in Germany and Japan and Hong Kong as you're traveling to these countries. But what happened that Sam became the guy that was passionate about visiting all these countries? Because that's such an interesting part of your story, and that would be worth interviewing you for hours on end just about that. It's just unfortunately that 180 countries in, you had this unfortunate series of events.
Yeah, so it all happened very organically, and I can talk about travel stories, as you mentioned, for a long time and feel really fortunate for those experiences. But when I graduated from undergrad in 2012, I took my first professional job in Singapore. And I originally only planned to be in Singapore for about 3 months, but I ended up staying for 6 years, and it was a fantastic opportunity, a great way to begin my professional career. I was working for a tech startup business and a regional NGO, the charity that was doing development work around Southeast Asia. And throughout this time, I traveled as much as I could. I was in my early 20s in the heart of Southeast Asia, had a little bit of flexibility in my work schedule, had the world's best airport in my backyard. And I took advantage of the opportunity to explore as much of the region and beyond as possible. And just a personal preference, when I traveled, I didn't like to repeat places. So even if I went somewhere and had a fantastic experience, the next weekend, the next holiday, the next opportunity I would just go somewhere different. And so I put this formula into play for about 6 years. And in early 2018, I realized that I had traveled to about 120 countries in the world. And it was at that point when I remember thinking, like, how many are there? I had always traveled because it was fun and I enjoyed it. But most importantly, I learned from it. Travel is the best education I've ever had. It was never about ticking boxes, checking places off a list. But I got to that point, I did a little bit of research and some more research, started looking at quite a few different things and decided that I was going to try and give that a shot.
So this is so counterintuitive to me because I can understand being the guy who has the checklist and the spreadsheet, and this is my goal. I want to get to 193 countries in the next 15 years. But if you're telling the truth and you were 120 countries in before you thought this was like a real thing, Singapore is a beautiful airport, probably the best in the world. African countries, really far away, right? South American countries, really far away. How did you get to that first 120 countries before you realized like you were doing a thing?
Yeah, so much of my travels was just rooted in this relentless curiosity. Singapore is a great place to be based. There were tons of places that I could travel to on weekends. Also, I would come back to the US to visit my family, usually twice a year in the summer and in the winter around Christmas time. And being in Singapore, I could travel basically it's in either direction I wanted. It's the other side of the world. So I would try to stop in different places and see. And it was always about learning, discovering, meeting people. And so that was how some of those further places from Singapore kind of worked their way into my plans. And so I just had this curiosity and did the best I could with it. And it happened very organically.
Is there like 100 countries where all you've seen is their airport, or did you make a point to get out and see something, or at least have a lunch in Croatia or something, or have you seen like 100 countries via their airport?
Yeah, sometimes in the extreme travel community, it's fiercely debated what counts as a visit and so forth. So for me, it was always about experiences and meeting people and relationships. So I didn't step over a border and step back and say I had been there, or like just go to, for me, airports don't count. For other people, they have different parameters. And I think that the beauty of travel is that it means something different to everybody. It can mean whatever somebody wants it to mean. And so for me, I didn't count airports. I didn't count stepping over the border. There were some places where I spent a few days. There were other places like Singapore. I lived there for 6 years. So
Right.
everywhere in between. And so I frankly I just, I didn't have like unlimited time or money or resources or contacts. So I just did the best I could. Frankly, just did the best I could. And there are some places where I spent a few days and thought, gosh, I would love to come back here at some point. I wish I had more time. There were other places where I spent a few days and was like, you know what? Like, I feel pretty good. Maybe I'll come back at some point, but I feel good about this visit and kind of everything in between. So I just did the best I could with what I had.
I asked you a question off stage after you gave your keynote, which, by the way, if any of you are looking for an excellent speaker to give an excellent keynote on overcoming adversity, hire Sam, because his keynote was awesome. And I didn't want to ask this question in the Q&A because I didn't want to be disrespectful. But when I asked you off stage, you're like, oh, that would have been a perfect question. When I think of like charity, NGO, tech startup, I'm guessing you weren't making $1 million a year. And so I asked you off stage, I'm like, how did you even afford this? Because you start thinking about travel tickets, $1,200, $1,500. Even if you're staying in hostels, $20 here, $30 there, food, travel, Lyfts, Ubers, whatnot. This can't be cheap, right? So like, how were you affording this as a young man in your first job working for a nonprofit? It doesn't even like compute in my brain how it would be forget fiscally responsible, how it would be fiscally possible to visit all of these countries on a shoestring budget.
Yeah, it's a great question. I appreciate it. A couple things I would say on that. One is that I was always working full time during my travels, with the exception of the last couple months when I was methodically finishing this journey. Also, for me, it was always about prioritizing travel over other things. And there were a lot of trade-offs along the way. And just a quick anecdote. I remember this was probably 10 years ago in 2015, 2016, sometime when I was in Singapore. And I went to lunch. I went to get some food for lunch, and I went to a local hawker center, which is in Singapore, it's like a cafeteria style experience and local Asian food for the most part. And I was getting chicken rice, and the lady who was serving it to me asked if I would like extra chicken with my meal. And she told me that it was going to be the equivalent of 50 cents. And I was like, I hummed and hawed about it and thought, you know what? No, that's okay. I'm going to save my money. Right. And an hour later, I'm back at work, and I was working on this trip for the upcoming weekend to Bhutan, which is a place that is notoriously expensive because of the visa that's required for visitors and so forth. And it was going to be like $3,000 for the weekend or something like that, like something insane. And I remember thinking like, I'm in 100%. I'm going, let's do it. And this was an hour after I had decided that I wasn't going to spend an extra 50 cents on chicken rice. So it really just became about prioritizing it. And that's what I cared about. That's what drove me. It was that curiosity, it was relationships, meeting people. and those experiences. So for me, it was just about experiences and prioritizing it. And also travel it doesn't always have to be expensive, especially early on. I can't tell you the number of 16 bed hostels I stayed in like Vietnam and throughout Europe and Southeast Asia and places like that. And as I progressed and spent more time working and all that, I was able to get my own room and then get a hotel and all that stuff. But it was always about those experiences.
It's funny because like I'm looking at this through the frame of like family of four. I don't want to sit in coach. I can't have a family of four stay in a hostel or even a Motel 6. It's if we go to Disneyland, which is 4 hours away from where I'm sitting right now. If we go to Disneyland, it's $5,000 for 2 days. And so I am remiss now that I didn't do more travel in my 20s when I could sleep in somebody's bathtub or eat chicken and rice instead of a steak dinner. I'm going to show this podcast to my 22-year-old son and be like, hey, man, when you have no responsibilities, no kids, now is the time to do it. Don't buy the vape pen. Don't buy the extra Dungeons and Dragon book. Book a trip to Costa Rica where you can stay in a hostel when you're 22 and healthy and young.
Yeah, that resonates with me, and I appreciate that. We all have our own journeys and our own experiences, and I feel fortunate for mine.
So before we get into the craziness, which was Syria, leading up to this point, were there other countries that you had visited where you felt unsafe or the State Department was telling you not to go, or you had some problem at the airport with your visa? Because it's a likely cover story. You work for an NGO. You're an American in 2019 when there is a lot of Middle East and African countries that are going through civil war. You've got hundreds of stamps in your passport. No offense, you probably look like a spy, right? I even asked you off stage. I was like, hey, man, do you really work for the CIA? And this is all just a cover story. So did you ever get someplace where there was like a standout problem or you felt for your safety prior to this tragedy in Syria?
There were a handful of places where I felt relatively uncomfortable, and I can mention a couple of those. But one thing I'll say is that in my experience, and I feel fortunate, I've traveled to every country in the world. In my experience, many of the places that are negatively perceived or that the Western media tells us we're not supposed to like, these were often many of the same places where I had some of my best experiences and where my perspectives were most meaningfully impacted. And so despite everything that was happening in Syria and other places, I was confident that the same was going to be the case. But we can have authoritarian leaders at the top and they can disagree with each other and cause all kinds of trouble, which is often heartbreaking. But underneath that, there are a lot of other things happening too. There are people just like us, and we're all fundamentally the same. In my experience, the overwhelming majority of people are well-intentioned, proud of their country, happy to help others. And it's often just a small subset of people who give a much larger group a bad reputation. I found that to be the case in a lot of different corners of the world. That said, I certainly had these episodes. I was in Haiti, in Port-au-Prince, and at the same time that I arrived, the same day, there were these riots in the streets, and I ended up staying locked inside my hotel for about 2 days. And it turned out that the government had sanctioned a nationwide spike in fuel prices. It was to remain compliant with some sort of IMF restructuring demand. But as the most developing country in the Western Hemisphere, this had a massive impact on everyday citizens, and they were unhappy about it. And it led to these riots and this instability. And it was uncomfortable being stuck in this hotel and seeing this happen outside. And other places, the two places in the world where I felt the most uncomfortable one was in Kabul. This was in 2018. It was pre-Taliban takeover, but still just a place with a lot of unpredictable acts.
Well, you went to Afghanistan in 2018?
2018, yeah, in September. Yeah.
Do you not have that fear receptor in your brain? Is that missing like these solo rock climbers? Because that sounds crazy to me.
No, for sure. And again, it really just goes back. I went there and had a fantastic experience hosted by incredible locals. A man let us stay in his house up in the Panjshir Mountains for a night. It was fantastic. Some of the best hospitality that I've ever experienced has been not only across the Middle East, but in many places around the world where, again, we see negativity. We're told we're not supposed to like these places, but there's a lot of other things happening too. And so that's one example of just really incredible hospitality. The place in the world though where I felt the most uncomfortable was in Mogadishu, in Somalia. And Somalia is the only country in the world that doesn't have a central form of government. Quite a few opportunities for improvement there. But I actually spent Christmas Day in Mogadishu. And again, just despite the instability, tons of hospitality, welcoming people, delicious food, all of the above. And so there's often this paradox between what we see online and what the State Department says and so forth versus my perspective and my experiences in these places. And I try to encourage people to just take those opportunities to actually learn as best they can. And of course, for me, safety was always the top priority. I mean, I don't think
Right.
it's cool to be in unsafe situations. I don't go looking for trouble, but I do at the same time encourage people to have that curiosity.
So you didn't want to go wander around the world famous gun markets of Mogadishu. Everything I know about Mogadishu is from the book Black Hawk Down and the movie Black Hawk Down. So probably not high on my list of places to visit, but I'm guessing like anywhere else, there's places in LA where if you go looking for guns and drugs, you're going to get yourself in trouble. People are always shocked how often my wife and I and the kids go to Mexico, but I'm like, I have never, ever felt unsafe in Mexico. And I've been in some very small towns in Mexico and I've been drunk in some very large towns. And as long as you're not looking for trouble, there is no problem. So what exactly did you do in Mogadishu?
I had a local guide. I went around town. Wasn't able to do like too much. Again, there's instability, but went to the beach again. Just experienced this hospitality. I stayed at a hotel that's known for hosting like diplomats and foreign dignitaries, and a secure facility. But that was pretty much what I was able to do. Just experience some of the places of the city, but remaining safe and away from any of those conflicts.
Do you know off the top of your head what's like the shortest journey you had into a country and what's the longest? Obviously, Singapore, you
I
lived there
mean,
for 6
the
years.
one, yeah, like probably Vatican City or something. I've been a bunch of times, but just going for the day or something like that. So that's
I forgot
probably
that Vatican City is considered its own country. So you did the
yeah.
Sistine
I mean,
Chapel tour and
it's
called it a day?
it's not technically one of the 193 because it's an observer, but it's a place that I didn't spend the night in.
I was tallying up the number of countries that I've been to because I feel like I'm fairly well traveled, and I think I've been to 12 or 13 countries. I just got to add one, the Vatican. I forgot about that we did take the Sistine Chapel tour.
There you go.
And then what about the longest stay? Did you get somewhere and you're like, oh, I got to extend this trip because this is the greatest place ever that I have visited?
Yeah, again, like I lived in Singapore, I lived in the UAE, I lived in France for a couple summers, so was there for several months. I spent a lot of time in the Philippines with the nonprofit. A lot of our work was there, so spent a lot of time over a 6-year period in the Philippines, which is one of my favorite places. So those would be some of the ones that I spent considerable time in.
So let's get to Syria. You land in May of 2019. And in preparation for the podcast, I was asking AI, I'm like, oh, what is the political situation in Syria in 2019? And like you said, you've already been preconditioned going to 180 countries before. Don't always believe what you on the news. Maybe don't always believe what you hear on the State Department because we're preconditioned to hate these places or these people and there's war going on. But I did look it up and I was like, oh yeah, Assad was still the president. They were 8 years into a civil war. The Kurds and ISIS were fighting. There was still like American special forces on the ground helping the Kurds fight ISIS. United States and Syria political back channeling was almost non-existent. So why Syria at that time? And then walk us through what happens after you land.
Mhm. Yeah. So there were, again, as I was saying, other places where those types of things were happening as well. There was all this kind of news, all these different things happening. And I would go and have some of the best experiences that I've ever had. I coached hockey in North Korea and had an incredible experience there despite everything that's happening. And the list goes on. Venezuela,
Wait, you
Iran.
coached hockey in North Korea?
I did. Yeah, I was invited there. I coached their national hockey team and this was in 2016. And that was how I went to North Korea.
So they'll give you a visa if you have a special talent like coaching hockey?
So yeah, I was invited there on this kind of cultural exchange or sports exhibition. And I'm not oblivious to the fact that I saw what they wanted me to see. And
Right.
getting off that tourist track, things can look very different. But again, my experience was incredibly positive. I was treated very well. Then the food is delicious. You probably had Korean food. The hospitality was fantastic. It was also very memorable to use a sport to build a cultural bridge, something that really sticks with me today. But anyway, I can talk about that. But for Syria, so one of the most important ways that I ensured safety throughout my journey was to follow the path of another traveler ahead of me. And that was what I did here as well, and followed that path. And I was confident that things were going to be safe, and I was going to have a meaningful experience and get to understand some of the culture, meet people, and so forth, despite everything that we see in the news, just given my experience in other places. That was not the case. And on May 25th, 2019, I went to the northeast region of Syria. I went to a town called Kamishli. And just 2 hours after arriving, I was walking through a roundabout on the way to meet up with my guide when all of a sudden a black pickup truck abruptly pulled up next to me. Two armed men jumped out of the back seat, instructed me to get inside. And thankfully, they weren't violent, but I didn't have a choice. I was scared, confused. I had no information or anyone to help. I was desperately trying to understand what was happening. And it turns out these men were loyal to the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad. And they told me that they were skeptical about my travel history and my travel motives. And as I briefly mentioned at the beginning of this, as we sped down back alleys of the city, the officers in the vehicle, they accused me of espionage, of being an American spy and collaborating with terrorists in the region and so forth. And nothing like this had ever happened before. And that was how that happened.
Yeah. If you look at just the city of Damascus, superly culturally relevant, right? Super culturally relevant. I was just looking up fourth most important city to Muslims as far as holy places, site of St. Paul's conversion, right, on the road to Damascus to Christianity, one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world with a history dating back at least 11,000 years that we know about. So I'm guessing you're telling these people, hey, I'm here to visit the cultural relevance of your city and your country. And like I said, with 180 passport stamps, they're probably not buying it, right?
For sure. Syria, Damascus specifically, is a place that I always wanted to travel to. As you mentioned, those points, Syria, from a religious standpoint too, like I'm Catholic, some of the most important kind of historical Christianity sites and places of significance are in Syria. It's mentioned more than 300 times in the Bible. Mary Magdalene was of Syrian descent. King David conquered northern Syria. Paul the Apostle's conversion took place on the road to Damascus. And as you mentioned, John the Baptist's tomb is there. The only people, I believe this is accurate, and maybe you or someone listening to this can correct me or kind of shape this, but I believe that today the only people in the world who still speak, like on a daily basis, Aramaic, the language that Jesus spoke, are living in Syria. So this in southern Syria. So this is a place that's incredibly significant from a religious standpoint as well, which was another reason that I was interested.
Amazing. So you're in this black SUV. I can picture this straight out of the movies. And what happens from them? Do they bring formal charges, or do they just lock you away and throw away the key, or what do they do?
I was put in the vehicle, and a few minutes later, the officer sitting next to me, he reached into his pocket and he pulled out a blindfold and he put it over my eyes. And the truck drove for about 30 seconds, and then it stopped again. And I stepped out of the van and I looked up. I took the blindfold off and they took it off. And then I looked up and I was underneath a massive Syrian military airplane out on the tarmac of an airport. And they handcuffed me behind my back, took me over to the ladder and threw me into the cargo hold of the plane. And about 30 minutes later, the plane took off. And I remember I realized at this point that I was now flying on an airplane, but I didn't know where it was going. And just this overwhelming cloud of uncertainty was growing all around me. And about 90 minutes later, we landed in what I learned to be Damascus, the Syrian capital city. And I was taken from the airport, driven into the center of town, and taken into the basement of a facility that I now know is called Syria's Military Intelligence Prison number 215. And I was held here in solitary confinement in a dungeon for 27 days. And the only human interaction I had was for a few seconds in the morning and evening when the guards brought bread and boiled potatoes and water.
Did you think you were going to die?
I did. I did think that was possible. And that was something that I came to manage. I did think that was possible. Yeah.
Any communication at all from the guards, or I'm sure that they don't have Miranda rights there where they have to read you Miranda or give you a lawyer or give you your one phone call. Was there any inkling about what's going on after that initial conversation of, we don't believe your intentions, we think you're a spy? For those that are listening to podcasts instead of watching the podcast, you're not exactly tan or brown. You're about as lily white as they come. So you're clearly from the United States or Canada or maybe Europe. But was there, you don't exactly blend in Middle East countries. Like, was there anything that they told you or did for you, or was there any rights, or were you really thinking they had just locked you up in solitary confinement in a dungeon and this is where you're going to stay?
One of the biggest challenges that I faced was a lack of communication and a language barrier, because I don't speak any Arabic and they don't speak or weren't willing to speak any English. So I didn't have any information. To that point, the most challenging part of that situation was the uncertainty. So I sometimes say, if I told you, Scott, hey, you're going to go and you're going to sit in solitary confinement in a dungeon. You're going to be given bread and boiled potatoes and water. You're going to hear people around you being tortured, but you're not going to be physically harmed. And on day 27, you're going to be released. Now, I'm not saying that you would be comfortable, but what I am saying is that you would be in a totally different situation having that finish line, knowing that on day 27, you're going to be released. And for me, I didn't know that was going to be the case. And based on the information that I had, I believed, I didn't even have any information that could eliminate one of these options from the table. So was I going to be released in 5 minutes? Based on the information I had,
Maybe.
I thought that was possible. Maybe, right? Was I going to be in that cell forever? I thought that was possible. Was I going to be released in a week? Were they going to just open the door and shoot me or stop feeding me or torture me? Based on the information I had, I believed that all of these potential options were possible, and trying to entertain them 24/7 was emotionally and psychologically exhausting.
So for that month that you're there, how did you prevent yourself from going crazy? Because I'll go down these rabbit holes when I'm in the safety of my own office. You start to catastrophize. If this goes sideways and then I don't get this deal and then I don't get this referral, and then it turns out that everybody thinks I'm a fraud, and then I don't get any deals, then we're broke, then my family's living on the street. I'm like, what am I doing, right? And that's in the safety of my own office where I have complete control of autonomy of everything in my world. And when that's all taken away from you, like, what tools did you develop, or what history did you have from your childhood, or what like innate personality traits did you have to make it through that? Because I got to think like a lesser man might have just drove themselves crazy in that month that you're in solitary.
It took me a little bit of time to develop some of these tools, and this is a lot about what I speak about today. In that cell, I found strength by really doing three key things. The first, number one, after several days of pacing back and forth, I stopped. I said, hang on, wait a second. Maybe there's some good in this situation. Maybe there's some positivity or something to be grateful for.
If you found a silver lining in this, I'm going to be mesmerized.
To that, this kind of, to your reaction, this inner voice replied and was like, Sam, are you crazy? You've just been taken hostage. There's nothing good here. There's nothing to be grateful for. The best this will ever be is a period of your life you can forget. I fought that inner voice, and I did discover these kind of silver linings, so to speak. I said to myself, I'm grateful to be alive. I'm grateful for my health, my education. I'm grateful for the basic food and water I'm being given. I actually said to myself, I'm grateful for the air that I'm breathing, and that the guard who just delivered me a boiled potato smiled at me for 1 second. And these things may sound elementary or insignificant. But what I found was that each one of these small expressions of gratitude became this like silent rebellion against the uncertainty of the situation. The first, perhaps a bit paradoxically, was to lean into gratitude.
Yeah, that sounds interesting on a podcast, but I don't know that most people would be able to get there mentally in this situation. I guess the alternative is
time to get there.
I was gonna say, I guess the alternative is you just throw your head into the wall and kill yourself, but that doesn't sound like a great option either. How long did it take you to get over the initial shock, the despair, the mental breakdown, which I'm sure anybody would have gone through in this situation, to get to this idea of, oh, there is some gratitude, there is some silver lining, there are some lessons to be learned here?
It took some time. There's this being kidnapped flow of feelings. It's confusion and then fear and then anger and despair. So it all flows, and those for the shock initially too. The first few days are so many of these emotions and trying to manage them. And there were all kinds of things going through my head. As a kid, so I'm the oldest of five. I have two younger brothers, two younger sisters. We used to, as kids, we would play Mario Kart on Nintendo 64. You probably played it. I remember there'd be times when I'd be racing and would drive off a cliff or something, and I would think, hang on, reset. Hey, everybody, we need to do this. We need to do this race over again. Just hit the reset button. And in that cell, those first couple of days, especially those first few hours, I was thinking like, I need to go back to the roundabout, like reset. Something happened here. I need a mulligan, but this obviously wasn't a video game. It was real. And at the beginning, I was expecting like Ashton Kutcher to swing open the cell door and be like, you got punked, right? All these kind of memories were burning off in my brain, trying to deal with kind of those emotions that you were talking about.
And you mentioned your Catholic faith. How much does that play into it? Did you spend a lot of time praying? Did you just know that whatever the plan is, this is the plan? Did your belief in God help you through these times?
It was critical. I would have been in a totally different situation without that. I talk about, as I was mentioning, talk about gratitude, talk about controlling the things that I can control, I talk about recognizing the uncertainty of the situation as this opportunity for growth. And those were all huge. But nothing was more important than my faith. Everything had been taken from me. My material possessions, my communication, my freedom. But no matter what, I knew that my faith was absolute. And that's what I had to hold on to when everything else had been taken. And what I realized was that I didn't need a phone or permission from the guards to talk to God.
Hey there, Scott Groves with a quick interruption to the podcast. Sorry about that, but I just want to take a quick minute to announce our sponsors here for the podcast. And that sponsor is me, Scott Groves. It's actually the revenue that we generate through doing mortgages here at Neo Home Loans, and the money that we generate from the coaching program that I run, Consolidated Coaching for Loan Officers, coaching by loan officers for loan officers, that helps support this podcast. I really started this in 2021 as a passion project during COVID, and we're excited to bring you a new episode every week. But this only happens if I'm making money in my real full-time job. So please, if you or somebody you know is looking to buy, sell, or refinance a house, our team is licensed in almost every state in the country. And if you know a loan officer who's looking for sales coaching, personal development coaching, lead generation coaching, please get in touch with us. Scott at the Scott Groves team. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love for you to support our other endeavors, which is mortgage financing and loan officer coaching, which allows this podcast to exist. Now back to your regularly scheduled programming. How much time do you spend doing that?
I had a whole section of my routine in that cell for prayer. My prayers became this uninterrupted conversation with God. I was constantly talking to him and pacing back and forth, saying things out loud. Even though they told me not to talk, I said, God, I'm here. I'm listening. What are you trying to tell me today? What can I learn today? Are there any positives about my situation today? I learned that we're never less alone than when we're totally alone with God. Something that I learned in solitary confinement for a month.
Say that again.
We're never less alone than when we're totally alone with God. And I'll have to say, I felt this unbelievable closeness to God in that cell. My faith was as strong as it's ever been. And I have to admit, in the wake of this, I've found it challenging to replicate that. And I think so much of it is because of all of the distractions in our lives. I think it's these things and everything that we have going on. And so I often try to challenge people to think about a time when in their life when they felt strongest in their faith and what would it take to replicate that and why can't we do it today?
Yeah.
It's something that I'm working through as well.
Yeah, I don't wish this experience on anybody. I know people that pay for like week-long retreats for meditation where they take away their phone and whatnot. And there's really no greater exercise in faith, prayer, meditation than what you went through because you have no other choice.
Sure. I think 30 days of silence can be very powerful from a faith standpoint and a personal development standpoint.
So what happens from phase one of your journey to phase two, where you go from dungeon prison to, if I remember correctly from your keynote, kind of like general pop?
Yep. On day 27, I was taken out of solitary confinement, driven across town to the outskirts of the city. I was taken to a facility called Adra, which is the country's central federal prison and a general population, as you mentioned. And I was put in a cell with about 40 other men. And I remained here for the next 35 days, for another month. And interestingly, the other inmates there, they became friends. We cooked and shared food together. They taught me Arabic. I taught them English. There was a prison basketball court, and I taught several of them how to play knockout. These men these men truly risked their life to help save mine. They were smuggling out communication. That they were this remarkable display of humanity. And I learned very quickly that virtually none of them were true criminals. They were just victims of this corrupt system in the country and have been caught up in the instability of the conflict. And through my travels, I learned a lot of different things. And these men essentially reinforce some of those things. Like I learned to never judge people by the actions of their government. I learned that people who have the least often give the most, something that I found to be true in all corners of the world. And kind of the list goes on, but that was essentially a snapshot of this second month.
In that second month, you're walking into a prison. You don't speak the language. You're being put in general population with 40 other people. Obviously, like Americans' frame for what goes on in prison is sensationalized movie violence. If you didn't have that experience of having already traveled to 180 countries, learning not to judge a book by its cover, understanding how hospitable people are in other areas that we're supposed to believe they're not going to be hospitable, how much did that play into your being able to integrate with these guys quickly versus you having a fear of them having a fear of you? If I was to walk into general population in any prison, not having the experience you've had, I'd be terrified I'm going to get shanked by the first guy that sees me because that's what in prison movies. Like, how much did that affect your ability to quickly assimilate, for lack of a better term?
I think it certainly helped. It helped. However, I was still thinking many of those things. I'd never been in a prison before, anywhere. Was still thinking those things that I'd seen in movies or we read in books or we see on TV, wherever it may be. Having that experience in my perspective certainly helped, but I was still terrified. I had no idea what every minute was going to bring. And the best reference I had for that was a lot of the things that you just described.
Yeah. And so what happens during that 30 plus days that you're there in the general population? Like you said, you taught them a little bit of English. They taught you a little bit of Arabic. Like, how do you start to communicate with them? And then how in God's green earth did you make friends with somebody quickly and deep enough for them, a political prisoner who knows what Assad is willing to do to political prisoners, willing to risk their life, I would think. I don't think that's being melodramatic, to help you smuggle out some information and kind of get the wheels going to get you out.
Yep. So I learned somewhat quickly that like a handful of them spoke English, at least enough to communicate. So I kind of gravitated towards them. And these were truly incredible people. I know it sounds cliche, but some of the best people that I had ever met anywhere in the world, and some of the best hospitality I've experienced anywhere in the world has been across the Middle East. And I'll never forget, about 2 weeks into that second month, I was on the same thought track as what you just outlined. I said to one of them who had become a friend, I said, hey, everybody here is being the inmates, not necessarily like the guards and the regime and all that, but I said, everybody here is being so nice to me. It was just hard to know what to expect in a situation like this. And he said to me, he said, Sam, in Syria, all the good people are here in prison because all the bad people are outside putting us in here. And it was this very sobering comment to hear. And so it just speaks to the fact that these other men in the cell were truly incredible people. And they had just been, as I mentioned, caught up in the political instability and the conflict, and were not true criminals and were really incredible people.
Yeah, it reminds me of that scene in The Count of Monte Cristo where he's talking to, I can't remember the guy's name, the sage, and I'm innocent. He's, of course you're innocent. They don't put guilty people here. They only put the innocent people here because they don't want anybody to hear their story. Have you read The Count of Monte Cristo?
I think that there's a parallel there for sure.
Oh man. Okay, so what happens that kind of sets the wheels in motion for your eventual release? Because this is just you can call it a crazy coincidence, you can call it fate, you can call it God, but the way in which you get information over and then that works to basically get you released it has to be an act of God. It's too much of a coincidence.
Yeah, for me, there's no other explanation that makes any sense. But on a quick snapshot here, so July 26th, 2019, one of the inmates came to the cell I was in and he called my name and he indicated that I was sorry. One of the prison officials came to the cell I was in and he indicated that I was being moved. And as he escorted me outside, he stopped and he said, hey, Sam, you're very lucky. President Assad has agreed to release you. And this sounds encouraging, but I had been lied to so many times in the past 2 months that I had essentially become immune to believing anything like this. But I got into this black SUV and I was actually deported all the way to Beirut, the capital city of Lebanon. And I got to the Office of Lebanon's internal security, like the equivalent of the FBI here in the US. And when I walked into the office, my parents were there, culminating this moment that was just indescribably emotional and one that many people thought would never happen, and this breathtaking display of God answering prayers. And I had the opportunity there to meet and thank a man named General Abbas Ibrahim, who heads Lebanon's internal security, and he had mediated my release with the Syrians. And I say one of the most overwhelming things for me when I was released, and still today, is just learning about everything that happened on the outside while I was trapped on the inside, and none of which I knew anything about. And so just a quick snapshot here, kind of in a nutshell, everything that I'm about to share, I learned secondhand because I didn't know about any of it. But the news of my disappearance was essentially learned through me going dark. Through my travels, I was always very good about keeping in touch, especially if I was in more of an unstable place. And I had communicated that I was going to be in Syria for just a few days. And when that time passed and people weren't hearing from me, they began to worry. And my father works in civil engineering. My mother is a registered nurse turned educator. Both of them are smart people and have had relative success in their respective professional fields, but they're an average family from St. Louis. They had no idea what to do when their son went missing in the Middle East. But thankfully, they began to act, and they reached initially the FBI field office in St. Louis, which pretty quickly escalated to some of the highest levels, the U.S. government in Washington. And throughout my captivity, my family had this roller coaster experience with the U.S. government. But early on, the government communicated two key things to my family. The first, and they said, we strongly recommend that you keep this out of the news. Keep all of the communication very tight. Don't let the press get a hold of this because if they do, and Sam's captors, depending on who they are, which was still unknown at the time, feel that type of pressure, they might just kill him. Then the second thing they said was you should really manage your expectations. They said, we have no diplomatic or economic ties with Damascus. There may not be a whole lot we can do here to help. So fast forward 3 weeks later.
And by the way, that's so hard for me to hear because I'm quite the libertarian. And like you said, you don't want to judge other people by the actions of their country. I would not want me to be judged by the action of our countries, but I still think there's a great benefit in being an American citizen. I still think there's a great benefit traveling on an American passport. Like I would have in my mind that, oh, if I got stuck somewhere, the Navy SEALs are coming, Delta Force is coming to raid the village straight out of a movie, raid the prison and get me out. These are the things I would think. So for your own government to tell your parents, hey, manage expectations, he might not be coming back or he might be coming back in a body bag. I can't imagine the emotional damage that did to your parents.
Yeah, absolutely. And they have their own kind of stories within this story to deal with having to manage expectations and being told that. And I think that the American government and military is incredibly capable. There are sometimes situations that do become trickier than others, but certainly grateful to be an American. Absolutely. Just getting back to the kind of the end of this story here. Yeah, with everything that you just described being the case and my parents and family dealing with that communication, it was about 3 weeks later when my younger sister, Stephanie, who she was 25 years old at the time, she was living in Nashville, and she particularly became overwhelmed with everything that was happening. And she decided that she needed to call someone and talk to them about this and just blow off some steam, which was against the recommendation of the US government of keeping all of the communication very tight. And so she decides that she's going to call her former college roommate, who is coincidentally also named Stephanie. So there's this phone call between the Stephanies, and as the story goes, it starts out, hey, how you doing? And my Steph says, actually, things aren't very good. And she goes on to explain, my brother's been missing for weeks and nobody's heard from him. We're working with all of these agencies and officials. Nobody's been able to help. We're really scared. And roommate Steph is, of course, shocked to hear something like this, but she says all the right things and offers her full support. And at the end of the call, as the story goes, roommate Steph says, hey, if there's anything I can do, just let me know. And my Steph responds almost jokingly or sarcastically. She says, honestly, unless you know someone who knows Assad, the Syrian president, please just pray. And our roommate Steph says, wait, let me call you back. And it turns out that roommate Steph is Lebanese, and her uncle is good friends with General Abbas Ibrahim. General Ibrahim has, as I mentioned, this back channel relationship with the Syrians and was able to mediate my release when so many others were struggling to do anything. And so it became this situation where he go down like the FBI, the CIA, the White House, Pentagon. Pope Francis was involved, Russian intelligence, Middle East NGOs, private sector security companies. They were all in one way or another struggling to be effective. But then my sister's college roommate can identify a path to get an American hostage released from captivity in the Middle East. It puts so much into perspective. I couldn't be more grateful. And as you were saying, it's just this incredible display of the way that I think God will use ordinary people to do extraordinary things.
Had there been any communication at this point? Like when you get to general population, were you able to write letters or get a phone call or get on the internet? Or did your family have any proof of life at this moment when Stephanie calls Stephanie?
One of the other inmates had helped me send out a letter, kind of smuggle out a letter. Another one had helped with an Instagram message, and they did the best they could, but I never got anything. Like I didn't, there was like very thin communication. My family had some idea that I might be alive and might be in a certain facility, but it was like very thin at that point.
Again, the libertarian in me, I can't help but mention that the moral of the story is never listen to your government. Trust your sister more than the CIA. I'm just joking. I know you can't endorse that statement, but but yeah, I find it. How many thank you gifts have you bought for roommate Stephanie? And if you're not married and she's not married, how have you not married this lady that found the back channels to Lebanon?
Yeah, no doubt. Like certainly very good family friends. And yeah, if people ask, do you get the Stephanies a special Christmas gift every year or something like that? And yeah, I think their roommate Steph, she could have said, hey, I'm okay, I'll think about it or I'll do what I can. But she took action. And I think millennials sometimes problem solve differently despite what they're told to do. I think that action, I think there's a lesson in there for all of us. And for me, I just couldn't be more grateful.
Man. And how was it that Stephanie calling a friend who knew the general or a family member who knew the general who knew Assad? Have you ever gotten the story on why these people, again, Syria is going through a civil war. They have almost no diplomatic relations with the US. There's all kinds of back channeling going on with Russia. They're fighting the Kurds and ISIS and everything else. Did you ever find out why these people were willing to call in a favor and or put their reputation on the line to save Sam Goodwin, an American that they didn't know from a hole in the ground?
Yeah, if I could have the full, complete answer to one question, it's really around this. Like, why was I targeted? Why was it released? What was the deal? And I don't have all the information today. It could have been wrong place, wrong time. It could have been travel history. Potentially, the Lebanese wanted to bolster their relationship with the United States. There could have been some geopolitical considerations there. So I don't have all the information up to this point. But as you were saying, certainly continue to write a lot of thank you letters.
Yeah, how do I get this General Abbas Ibrahim on the podcast? Well, we want to hear what was going on in his world.
Yeah, it certainly has some interesting insight.
Had you previously been to Lebanon, or did you get to mark this off as country 181 because you got released in Lebanon?
Yeah, you know what? When we crossed into Lebanon, the main things on my mind were like the well-being of myself. What's going to happen? Where's my family? How are they doing? Am I going to be alive? All these different thoughts. I will say though, way down the priority list, there was this very quick thought that was, gosh, I'm not even getting a new country today. So I'd actually been to Lebanon several months earlier. So that was how that came together.
So one of the things that I really appreciated about your keynote, and by the way, if anybody's intrigued by this, which I am, buy Sam's book, Saving Sam, because he goes into more detail about how he got the letter out and the relationships that he built with the men in the prison in Syria. And he really dives into the whole story and a lot of background information, a lot of other anecdotes about countries that you visited. So I highly recommend the book, Saving Sam. One of the things I appreciated about your keynote is you very beautifully surmised these are the lessons I can take out of this experience. We talked about it a little bit with your faith and finding the silver lining and gratitude, but you had some really specific lessons of, because I've been through this experience, here's some things that I can teach others, and not just in the manner of safe travel, but just as like life skills. So can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Over the past few years, and as kind of referenced, I've learned that the same approach that I took to managing the stress and uncertainty of being in that prison cell is the same recipe of responses that I use when managing uncertainty in my life today. And there are lots of ways to embrace and manage uncertain times. But the three key points that I talk about that they helped me, and I think they can help all of us. The first is to lean into gratitude always. I think this is where everything begins. This is what grounds us. This is the price of admission to even be able to consider doing the next two things. The second is to take action, control what we can control. I think if we're honest with ourselves, I think we will say that our personality today, the very essence of our life, is a result of the challenges we've faced and the choices we made as a result of those challenges, not necessarily because of the good times that we've had. And we can be held hostage by anything: alcohol, drugs, illness, relationships, finances, injuries. But the way that we embrace and manage those challenges, the actions we take, I think that defines who we become. The third is I talk about recognizing uncertainty as an opportunity. And I was pushed to this point of overwhelming uncertainty, truly life or death. And people ask me quite a bit, Sam, if you could go back, would you still travel the way you did or do anything differently? And on one hand, I would never want to relive captivity, and I wouldn't wish that on anybody. But on the other hand, and more importantly, I would also never want to give up everything that's come from it. The opportunity to meet some remarkable people. I wouldn't be here today without this. So to meet some remarkable people, to grow in character and in faith and in really just understanding of the stuff in life that actually matters. And those two things go together. As an athlete entrepreneur, traveler, hostage. I'll just say I think
Weird
there's
thing to add to your resume.
yeah, yeah. I think there's value and opportunity in every experience.
And tell me a little bit about the people that you met there. Have you been able to reconnect with any of them, either social media, pen pals, anything like that? Or are those people you served with that, like you mentioned, were the good people that were stuck in prison because all the bad people were outside running the government? Have you got to reconnect with any of them and and just find out their story?
So over the past several years, a handful of them have also been released and they've gotten in touch. And I'm in touch with quite a few of them today, which has been fantastic. Again, truly just these incredible people. Some of them are still in Syria. Some of them have fled to Turkey or Lebanon or into Europe. And I try to do what I can today to help them, especially after they helped me at such a tough time. 2 summers ago, my mother and I went to Turkey and we met up with two of them. And my mother was in tears as she thanked them for helping me during that time. And then on December 8th, 2024, when Assad was overthrown, the prisons were essentially empty and even more of them were released. Really happy to stay in touch with quite a few of them today and just really great people.
If the situation gets more stable there, will you ever go back and finish that trip to Damascus?
I have a complicated relationship with Syria, but I would love that opportunity. As I mentioned, it's one of the most historically, culturally, religiously significant places in the world. I didn't get to experience it the way I wanted to. So I would really love that opportunity. And I hope and pray that there's some meaningful progress in the future for the country and for the region.
I would be remiss if I didn't mention that when you got back, you still had 18 countries to go or 15 countries to go, 13 countries to go, whatever it was. What was that conversation with your parents like, where it's okay, got to finish the mission? And did you have any potentially dangerous or concerning places that you had to travel in those last, whatever it was, 12, 13, 15?
Yeah, despite everything that had happened, that original curiosity about the world had really never been stronger. When I first came home, my family pretty much shackled me to the kitchen table and wanted to throw away my passport. But that eased. And after several months of reflection and putting things into context and having lots of conversations, there were new variables in play. And I actually promised my parents I wouldn't go anywhere until they were comfortable with it, because they had gone through something that was life changing, life or death. But they also knew the time and energy resources I'd put into the journey. So it was a balance there. And there were, as you suspected, a lot of conversations. But I became very committed to not letting what happened conquer me. One of the most significant steps I took to addressing that was to continue what I had been pursuing beforehand. And it was there were 12 countries left. And on December 31st, I made one final trip, and that trip was to Brazil. And with that, I had traveled every country in the world. I'm joining a group of only about 100 people in history at the time who had ever done that.
Wow. Is there any concern that now that you've had this experience, even though you've worked past it with your family and with taking additional travels, is there any concern that you're more of a target if you go to another country now that you've had this experience and you've written the book and it's like you would almost be like a merit badge on some other country's lapel because look, we got Sam too. Does that worry you at all, or can you not think about that type of stuff?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't think so. Since this time, I'm still going to have traveled occasionally. Most of my travel now is around North America, but I've traveled internationally and haven't had any issues. I've talked to the State Department. My passport's all clear. It's not flagged in any way. I can still get pre-check and have clear and all that, but I'm not concerned about those things. Maybe something will come up at some point. I hope not. But up to this point, yeah, thankfully haven't had any issues.
I love it. There's a couple questions I always like to end the podcast with, but since we have you, I have to ask a couple additional questions. When we say world traveler, you are the definition. And I know this is on your website, so I'm cheating because I looked them up. But on your website, you have some of your favorite places. What is the most favorite place that stands out? This is just something where everybody needs to do this trip or this location or this country once in their life.
Yeah, from a travel standpoint, after the US, I would say New Zealand. I think it's the most naturally beautiful place in the world, and it's worth every second of travel required to get to its corner of the world.
Nice. And then a couple questions to end. What is Sam looking most forward to, right? Going into the middle and end of 2025. What are you doing now? Is it full-time speaking, books, podcasts, things like that. What are you most looking forward to, whether that's travel or life goals or business goals? And then I always got to ask, what's your favorite movie and why? Because I'm a movie junkie, so I feel like I can learn a lot about a person from a movie perspective. And if you say Midnight Express, I'm just going to laugh out loud. For those of you that haven't seen Midnight Express, it's a similar story by a person that put himself there because he tried to smuggle drugs across the Turkish border, not a recommended plan of attack, but he also ended up in a Turkish prison, I think, for years. And the movie Midnight Express is just a movie about another person's harrowing experience, which I'm not as sympathetic to because he put himself there. But favorite movie and why, and what's Sam looking most forward to?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So I don't feel so much survivor's guilt as I feel what I would characterize as survivor's responsibility. And I view the world through a spiritual lens. I feel like I was given this for a reason, and I'm grateful to say I do speak full time today, and I really enjoy it. But I think I hope to continue working towards just giving more than I take. That's how I want to be remembered, as someone who gave more than I took, and trying to continue to use these experiences to help others, share something that can be helpful to other people. So I'm looking forward to continuing to be able to do that. And favorite movie, I'm not really a movie junkie, but I'd maybe say Happy Gilmore, just as a hockey player. So,
do you know that number 2 is coming out in November on Netflix?
I have caught wind of that. Yeah, so we'll see how it comes together.
Happy Gilmore was not on my bingo card for somebody as well-traveled and serious as you. So I love that you threw a curveball in there.
There you go. Yeah, love that.
Man, I hope that this podcast generates like more book sales for you and some keynotes, because your story is powerful, and we just hit the tip of the iceberg. I've now heard your story a couple of times, and I just want to coalesce everything together because you shared some stuff in that keynote that was different but amazing. And man, I just wish you all the best. If you ever get out here to travel to Vegas for an event, I'd love to take you out to dinner and just pick your brain more on travel tips so I can pass that wisdom on to my kids.
No, I would love to, Scott. So happy to be connected. And I'll just put something out there. I don't know if people have gotten this far into the episode and are still listening. I have a small thing that I want to throw out there. So I have throughout my travels, I carried this North Face backpack with me the entire time. And it went to every single country in the world. And actually, when I was taken hostage in Syria, it was in the hotel room. And I thought it was going to be gone, and the CIA got it back and was reunited with it. And so it sounds weird, but it became like this character in my story. And when people hear about this, they always say, you got to connect with North Face. Like, they would love to know about this, right? And it's piqued my interest. And I'm at a point where I'm just interested in like having a conversation with someone at North Face. I recently posted a reel on social media about the backpack, and essentially I just think they would be interested to know. I think it might be the most traveled North Face product ever.
I love it.
Which is maybe a weird superlative, but if anybody listening has some kind of contact at North Face, I would love to just have at this point, all I'd be looking to do is just have a conversation with them. I think it'd be fun.
If the Sam Goodwin North Face day pack ever drops, send me a link and I'll buy them for everybody in our coaching, because that's a great story.
You got it. That's a deal.
All right, man. Thanks for being on. I appreciate you so much.
Yep. Thanks, Scott.